What should the Scrum team do when the product owner cannot attend any of the Scrum events for whatever reason? So folks, in today's video podcast episode, I will share with all of you on how I would tackle this situation as a Scrum Master. If you're interested with this topic, stick around, don't go anywhere because I'll be back right after this one.
What's happening, awesome Scrum Masters? Are you ready for another food for thought to improve your Scrum Mastery? The journey towards becoming a Scrum Master is challenging but rewarding. Today's podcast is brought to you by a Scrum.org professional Scrum trainer and a coactive coach with over 15 years' experience inspiring and enabling aspiring Scrum Masters like you. So buckle up and get ready. From Brisbane, Australia, here's your host, Joshua Partogi.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time and whenever you are watching to today's video podcast episode, folks. As for me, I'm doing quite well. I did a lot of rearranging at my house. I also learned a lot of new stuff to prepare myself for the upcoming year. And most importantly, I hung around with my family enjoying this year's holiday season, folks. The past 2 years has been quite tough for many of us. Some of us are separated from our loved ones, and I hope that you can reunite with your families again in this holiday festive season, folks. So, folks, I noticed that I haven't been podcasting since September 2021. So I thought before we close the year of 2021, I would like to take this moment to create one last podcast episode for the year 2021. We are now on episode 12, everyone. And if you are watching today's podcast episode on YouTube, as you can see, I am resurrecting the video podcast again. Yes, you heard me right. I'm doing the video podcast or the talking heads again. And I hope you are happy with that decision. And for those of you who already watched my video blog that I uploaded around end of May 2021, you may be wondering, how did I came up with this idea to resurrect the video podcast again? So here is the background story, folks. Around the second week of December 2021, which was a few weeks ago, I facilitated a virtual professional Scrum Master training for a group of Japanese, and they told me that the subtitle features on all of my videos on YouTube was actually helpful for them to learn and understand Scrum. Now that was quite mind-blowing for me, because I never thought that people actually read the subtitles on all of my videos on YouTube. So right after I heard that, after the virtual training session, I immediately created a poll on YouTube, and some of you participated in that poll. And from that poll, as of when this video is made, around 95% out of 41 respondents supported me, and they said, yes, continue upload that video podcast again. And that is the background story why I am resurrecting the video podcast again, folks. But don't worry, for those of you who still prefer the audio-only version and do not want to see me or see these talking heads for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, don't worry, all of the previous audio-only episodes are still available on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. If you do not know my podcast name, you can search my podcast with the keywords Think and Act Like a Scrum Master, either on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. So let's get back to today's topic. In today's episode, I'll be answering a question that one of you left on one of the video on my channel. And the question is, when a product owner is not around to attend any of the Scrum events for whatever reasons, what should the Scrum team do to tackle such situation? This question was submitted by Toyin Oluwatoyin Angel. I'm not sure if I pronounce your name correctly, Toyin. If I pronounce your name wrongly, please let me know so that I can pronounce your name correctly in the future. Thank you, Toyin, for the question. I really appreciate it. Now, as we already know, the product owner and the developers are also part of the Scrum team. Now, as there isn't much context mentioned in the question, and to simplify the whole explanation in today's episode, I will share with all of you on how a Scrum Master should tackle such situation. So the tips explained in today's episode are from the perspective of a Scrum Master. Now, if you're a Scrum Master in the Scrum team in this episode, I'm talking to you specifically. And also bear in mind, whenever I say Scrum events throughout today's episode, I'm only referring to sprint planning, sprint review, and sprint retrospectives, because those are the only 3 Scrum events that the product owner needs to attend. The product owner does not need to attend the daily Scrum, unless the product owner is also developing the product. Now, in that case, the product owner can also attend the daily Scrum. So my short answer to the question that was submitted by Toyin, or the TLDR version, is firstly, have the beginner's mind. Secondly, have empathy. And thirdly, be compassionate towards the product owner whenever this situation happens. And now, let's elaborate that 3 points even further. If you have already watched one of my videos on YouTube about the 8 hats the Scrum Master should wear, you should already know by now that one of the hats the Scrum Master should wear is the teacher hat. If it's a Scrum Master, you haven't taught the product owner about the values behind the Scrum events, then you need to spend time with them to explain it. Now, as a Scrum Master, you don't have to teach the product owner about the values of the Scrum events in a formal session. As a Scrum Master, you can explain it through an informal conversation. For example, while drinking coffee at a cafe or while drinking at a bar with the product owner. And while having a conversation, you as a Scrum Master can doodle either on a paper napkin or on a tissue, and you can ask the bartender or the barista for that. Now, after you notice the product owner have understood how the Scrum events can help them communicate their product vision and the product goals better to the developers, and also how the Scrum events can help them manage their product better, as a Scrum Master, schedule a session where the product owner and the developers can make a mutual agreement about the day and the timing to do the sprint planning, the sprint review, and the sprint retrospectives. And after the product owner and the developers have made a mutual agreement, I suggest you create a recurring event on any of the calendar tools your workplace is currently using right now, whether that is Google Calendar or Microsoft Outlook, so that the product owner will not book any other meeting on their calendar when the Scrum events will happen in the future. Now, assuming that you have already taught the product owner about the value of the Scrum events with your best effort and also with the best knowledge that you already have, and let's say the product owner still does not attend any of the Scrum events, then my suggestion to you is do not immediately judge the product owner. Remember to have the beginner's mind, as I have explained on episode 6 on my podcast. As this episode was not available on YouTube as a video podcast, it's only available as an audio-only episode, you need to listen to episode 6 either on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Apple Podcasts. When I was still new as a Scrum Master, I used to judge the product owners who didn't attend the Scrum events as difficult people, stubborn, and sometimes I even labeled them as arrogant. But then I realized my judgment towards the product owner affected my behavior towards the product owner, which at the end created an adversarial relationship between the product owner and I. It is important for any Scrum Masters to have the beginner's mind and not make any assumptions and make any judgment. On top of the beginner's mind that I have shared on episode 6, I also think that you must have an empathy towards the product owner. As a Scrum Master, put yourself in the product owner's shoes. As Stephen Covey said, seek first to understand, then to be understood. Ask yourself, why would the product owner not attend any of the Scrum events even though you have already taught them about the values of the Scrum events with your best effort and with all of the knowledge that you already have? If we look at the negative side, there is a possibility that they're ignoring whatever you have already taught them. But if we want to look at it with positive thoughts, there is also a possibility that the product owner currently has too many schedules on their plate. Maybe it's the end of the financial year, or maybe it's the end of the tax year. Or maybe the company is currently in the process of acquiring another company, and this process is not only absorbing the product owner's time, but also absorbing their energy. Or maybe currently the product owner is currently busy writing proposals for investors that needs to be sent as soon as possible so the company will not miss the next round of investment. Because there are so many possibilities that may be causing the product owner not attending any of the Scrum events, I suggest that you ask the product owner about the situation they're in. Have a conversation with the product owner, and remember to always enter the conversation with a positive intent. And as I said earlier, These kind of conversations do not need to be in a formal setup. If you and your product owner are working in a different geographic area, you can make an introductory conversation with the product owner over text message first before asking them about the situation they're in. You will be surprised what they would tell you about the situation they're in right now if you enter the conversation with a beginner's mind, a positive intent, and an empathy. And lastly, folks, to wrap up today's video podcast episode, which I've found is really important, is having compassion. Especially in a tough situation like the pandemic we're still experiencing right now, where many people are under a lot of pressure both at home and also at work. I personally noticed during the pandemic, people need to juggle with many things at once, and I also noticed some people are feeling insecure of being made redundant by the company. I'm saying this because I noticed during the pandemic, quite a few people were quite harsh and rude to me. They only look at the negative side of me, even though I have done my best to provide a service as a Scrum Master. But just because they were harsh and only saw the negative side of me, it doesn't mean I should not be compassionate to these people. In a tough situation like what we're experiencing right now, we should always choose to be compassionate towards one another. As a Scrum Master, be kind to each other in your Scrum team. Be kind to the product owner as you would also expect them to be kind to you too. If you are from the senior management position, this message also goes to you. So going back to the case of the product owner who do not attend any of the Scrum events and assuming that you as a Scrum Master first already have a conversation with the product owner, and second, you already understand the situation the product owner are in, and third, you already taught the product owner about the values of the Scrum events, and fourth, the product owner already told you that they do not have any bad intention for not attending any of the Scrum events, then be kind and be compassionate to the product owner and facilitate a conversation between the product owner and the developers. In that conversation, you can ask the whole Scrum team whether it's possible to make an exception in the sprint duration just during these tough periods. And also, folks, make sure to let everyone in the company know that your Scrum team is not going to make inconsistent sprint cadence as a habit. And once your team is out of the tough periods like the pandemic we're experiencing right now, your team is committed to get back to the regular sprint cadence. During this kind of conversation, you can also ask the whole Scrum team, how would it be possible to run the sprint planning, the sprint review, and the sprint retrospectives in a shorter duration, but yet still achieve the intended objectives of these Scrum events? The point is, the Scrum team should make a mutual agreement without neglecting there are still values in having consistency in attending all of the Scrum events. And your role as a Scrum Master throughout this whole process is to facilitate the creation of the mutual agreement. And that is all from me today, folks. I think this has been quite a long advice. I don't want to bore you and make it any longer. Thank you though for listening to today's video podcast episode. As I mentioned earlier, as there isn't much context mentioned in the question, this is as much piece of advice I can give to all of you. As we all know, Scrum is based on empiricism. Therefore, there aren't actually any step-by-step recipes when handling situations that occur in the Scrum team. But I do hope today's video podcast episode has given you some insights on how to handle such situations. Or perhaps today's video podcast episode has given you a new perspective about your product owner who does not attend any of the Scrum events, or perhaps it has given you a starting point for inspection and adaptation. I will talk to you again soon on my next video podcast episode. If you haven't subscribed to my podcast, go ahead and subscribe now on whatever platform you're currently listening to today's podcast episode. As I mentioned earlier, my podcast name is Think and Act Like a Scrum Master. And if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, make sure you subscribe now because I have a lot of exciting things planned for next year on my channel. Have a fantastic week, folks. Enjoy the rest of your holiday. Have a great time with your loved ones. Happy New Year. Hopefully, next year will be better than this year for all of us. And remember, before we leave, keep having the beginner's mind, stay curious, and stay awesome. Talk to you again next year. Bye, folks.